Good morning and welcome to another wonderful conversation about conversations with people on things that matter to us and create meaning in our time. In this time of COVID, we've got a lot of things on our mind, and we're talking with people who have a lot to offer us in how to process this moment. The guest that I have for you today is Dayle Spencer. Dayle is an incredible human being. She has a resume that is long and varied and wondrous. She's worked with the Carter Center. She was the founding director of their International Conflict Center there at the Carter Center. So she has that in her background. She's been working with Fortune 500 people for about 20 years, I think, with the Pangea Group. But today I am asking her to really tell us and help us to process what to do in transforming our grief. She is the president of a 501c3 called Loving Spirit Incorporated, and she has been doing wonderful work on transforming, rescripting, addressing, engaging with persons in grief, and the way that we handle that in our culture. And so I am incredibly inspired and delighted to welcome Dayle to talk with us today. And so here she is. And the question that I have to kind of start this conversation off, because we know that everybody has different types of grief. It's common in the human experience. We go through cycles of grief, and it's not really linear. It's cyclic, but certain times are more trying than others. And COVID has created this kind of unique reality of a shared global grief. So I wondered if you could share with us some of the things about grieving individually and collectively that you think are unique to this time.
Well, first, let me say thank you for having me with you, Anna. It's always a joy to be with you. This is a unique time. It's challenging for so many people on so many levels, and part of the challenge is this. This may be a moment in time where the entire globe is experiencing grief in one form or another. And grief isn't necessarily caused by the death of someone we love, although it certainly can be. It can be caused by anything that significantly shifts the meaning, identity, and structure of our lives. And so if you think about everybody you know right now, all of that is very much in play. If we're required to be isolated, if we lose our jobs because it's not safe for us to be open for business right now, if we are in fact feeling like we have some symptoms that might possibly be COVID-19, all of those kinds of things that are the bedrock of who we are very much in the air, and they may very well prompt a grief response. But grief is a very unique journey. You and I could be having the same set of circumstances, and yet our grief response would be unique to us because we bring to that circumstance our past history, our culture, our awareness of what grief is and how to navigate that journey and so forth. So even if the whole world is grieving, each one of us is grieving uniquely.
Absolutely. And truly, the worst grief, I was listening to something with David Kessler this morning, and the worst grief that we have or that we know of is our own.
Is our own.
Yeah.
Yes.
So as we're comparing grief and we're processing our grief, no matter what it is that you're going through, the worst grief is my grief, the thing that I'm having to deal with in this time. And so I thought that was kind of illuminating for my own understanding of how people are processing this stuff right now.
Well, because the only experience we have is our own.
Exactly.
People's experiences, and we never know what they're feeling. We don't know how stressed out they are. We may have conclusions that we make about that, but we can never know. So the only grief experience we have is our own.
I think it's important to keep that in mind as we're interacting with each other in our grief, and not to be harsh on ourselves and not to judge other people's grief as well. Because I think I'm seeing some some systemic problems with that, with the judgmentalness of
Yeah.
how we're grieving.
Yeah. Yes. And one of the most basic mistakes that Americans make when we try to console other people who are grieving is we often say, I know just how you feel, when nothing could be further from the truth. We have no idea just how anyone else feels. And sometimes when you say that, you don't realize if the other person may be taking that as an insult because their personal pain, the depth of that pain could be so great that the idea that anybody else could have an awareness of just how they feel might be offensive to them. So we use the wrong words when trying to be helpful.
Absolutely. And you're talking about culture and American culture and how we process things as Americans or even as Westerners and things.
Yes.
So you've been working for a while on how our culture deals with grief.
Hmm.
Um, and so you're trying, my understanding is that you're trying to rescript that into a healthier narrative. So
Yeah.
can you tell us some things that might help us in this time to rescript our own experience with grief?
Sure. Sure. Um, it's a mindset, really. If we would all adopt the mindset that when we're interacting with other people who are grieving, that we never use platitudes. And when I say platitudes, if anybody has any question about what that is, let me just suggest that you go to a gift card store and walk down the aisle where the grieving cards are, because those cards are filled with platitudes. Um, an example, when my own daughter died, Allie died at age 28 from the flu, which is what started me on this journey. One of my dearest friends, a person who'd known me since we were teenagers together growing up, came through a receiving line at her celebration of life and said, God will never give you more than you can bear. I know she said that because she is devoutly Christian. She said that because that's her true belief. And she said that to try to console me in a loss that she thought was inconsolable. And the truth of the matter was, those words actually were quite painful for me to hear because it made me instantly think that this was something God had done to me. So her attempt to use consoling words had the opposite impact than what she intended it to have. I think when we're trying to console someone who's grieving, possibly the safest thing we can say is simply, I'm sorry. And rather than talking, listening is a much better way to be truly consoling. Just letting the other person express what they're feeling, their concerns, their fears, their anger, whatever comes up for them, and holding a safe space so that that person can speak their truth without judgment.
Absolutely. So because a judgment ends up bringing this sort of decisions towards punishment.
Yeah,
You're either
right
punishing
and wrong.
yourself or punishing other people.
Yeah,
And so how we process, how we judge ourselves, how we judge other people really does have long lasting and possibly toxic effects on how we
absolutely.
interact with one
Yeah,
another.
absolutely. Especially in times of grief, where we need to be coming from when we interact with other people who are grieving is a place of acceptance. Accept that they could be angry, accept that they could be lashing out, accept that they could say harsh things, and know that they're in incredible pain right now. In psychological terms, we would say that they're in shadow behavior. That means they're the opposite of who they normally are because of all the stress, because of the frustration that they're feeling. So they're in a situation which is temporary, and if given patience and if given time, they would revert back to their highest self again. But when we judge them, we actually make it harder for them to recover. So, an attitude of acceptance, no matter what they say, no matter how they lash out, no matter what they're feeling or expressing, is a healthy way to step to someone's side.
I think that one of the things that I have seen in my own life and then in the lives of those around me is a lot of times it seems that people have difficulty accepting each other because they have difficulty accepting themselves.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, we
And
do.
we don't self-evaluate as a general practice. That's a hard thing and it can be very painful. And we
Yeah.
don't often, our culture doesn't encourage us, it seems, to take the time to really look at ourselves and learn about ourselves and be able to work through the scripts that have been put upon us through our families or through our culture or through the way things are or are supposed to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that it seems like we carry so much stuff, and then if we don't take the time, and there are many reasons why we don't take the time, but what if we don't take the time to really deal with all of these subscripts within the reasons why we do the things we do, then we're so caught up in trying to maintain that understanding of life that we
Hmm.
then are we don't grow. And especially in times of grief, we revert back to what's our base. I mean, this is my understanding. Maybe does that resonate with you or?
Well, let me tell you about in our Loving Spirit workshops. We've been doing these workshops now for 6 years, all across the country. And one of the processes that we take our participants through is a guided meditation called "Who Am I?" Because Anna, you've just hit on something very important. We all carry these images of who we are, and they're labels, and they're mostly not true. You know, they're reflections of other people or they're projections of other people onto us rather than being who we are at our essence. And so in this little guided meditation, when someone is in a relaxed and open, willing to consider new ideas kind of place, we then tell them, you know, you're not your name, you're not your family, you're not your story, you're not your possessions, and you're not your job, you're not your title, and you take away all of those external attributes of who a person is. And when this is done in a thoughtful and reflective way, they get much clearer about who they are in their essence. Most people come to realize is that all we are is spirit, all we are is energy. You know, this body is just a facade, the label. I mean, you're Dr. Anna Camphouse. I have a doctorate degree too in law, but that's just a label. You know, who are we when you remove all those false identities and the mask that we sometimes wear in public? And that's what you're getting at. And it's when we can come to our essence, when we can be clear about who I am and you can be clear about who you are, that allows us to reset, to begin to find our true north again and our way forward again. But if we're struggling in the muck around who we are and we're letting other people define us, it'll be so much harder for us to recover.
Thank you. That was eloquently said where I was kind of going with that. But that really has been my experience that when we get out of the things that we're just supposed to be, or our family thinks we should be, or our job thinks we should be,
Yeah,
all of the shoulds in our life, and we really make some time to look at ourselves and
exactly.
why we do the things we do and separate out the things that other people have said, this is who you should be, and
Yeah,
really identify the person and the soul, I would use the word soul, that we are.
absolutely.
um, then we can begin to say, well, if that's the case, and I feel um, called to this, or I feel led to do that, then, and that is what makes my soul happy and shiny and purposeful,
Yeah,
then all of a sudden everything can be re-scripted around you
yes.
to make that happen. And especially in times of grief, where we want to pull back, we have to have some kind of a roadmap to be able to have the space to look at ourselves and really remember who we are,
Yes.
and then be able to take that information and interact with these different pieces of our life in
Mhm.
order to kind of create something more whole, more healthy, and that has meaning. And I think it's a question for me too of how does grief lead us towards things that are meaning making, and more proactive. You talked about something in our conversation before called post-traumatic growth.
Yes.
Can you tell us about this concept and some of the ways that we may be able to take our own traumas, including COVID, but you don't have to just box it over here, and kind of come out healthier on the other side? What is that post-traumatic growth?
Okay. Everybody probably knows what post-traumatic stress is. That's when you have an experience that is so traumatizing and so frightening to you, it impacts you even years after the actual traumatic event. But you're still carrying around the emotional baggage from that event, and you may not realize it, and it may manifest in highly unpredictable ways. And so we've known about post-traumatic stress since the Vietnam War. We used to call it other things before the Vietnam War, but that's when we first came up with the label of post-traumatic stress. But what therapists and psychologists are now realizing is there is this other thing called post-traumatic growth, where people have a very traumatic experience, and yet they come through it somehow stronger and better because they had it than they were before they had it. To have you understand that, let me use an analogy of a scar. If you have a scar anywhere on your body, you've noticed, I'm sure, that the skin at that place looks different than the rest of the skin in the area. The reason for that is that scar tissue is not like typical epidermis and dermis layers of skin, which are quite thin. Scar tissue is almost like a rope, and it's knotted together and it's woven and it's very thick, like a cord of some sort. And so, of course, it looks different when we see it on our skins. But what happens is when you have a scar, that particular tissue is actually stronger than the rest of the skin on your body. That scar, your body knew to manufacture something that would serve you well over time because you were wounded. Now, Ernest Hemingway said in A Farewell to Arms that the world breaks everyone, and afterward, many are strong at the broken places. A scar is an example of how all of us can be stronger at our broken places. But imagine if instead of a wound on your arm or your leg, it was your heart space that was broken. Your heart was
Mm.
broken because a loved one died. Your heart was broken because you're dealing with illness in the family, or you're dealing with financial problems, or whatever. It is possible, if when our heart breaks, we are open to whatever comes up. We are willing to accept whatever comes up and look at that through a lens that says, what is my lesson? What is this experience trying to teach me? What lesson is the universe offering me through this injury or through this grief that I should be learning? And when we can look at our losses objectively, and when we can learn from that experience, that's when we have post traumatic growth, because we are more compassionate, we are more loving, we have more gratitude, we have a greater sense of forgiveness in our lives, precisely because we have also been broken. So that's how I would explain it.
Well, and that leads me into a more tender space with you,
Yeah.
because I know that your life before a few years ago was a different life, um,
Yeah.
and then this tremendously horrible thing happened, and your daughter, your beautiful, gorgeous, wonderful daughter, Allison, who was healthy and well and 28 years old and did all these incredible things, got the flu,
Yeah.
just randomly the flu, and died.
Yeah. Yeah. At age 28. Yeah.
And it was just, it was such a shock to to everyone, me and everyone that knew you, that this could happen. It was just unbelievable at the time. And one of the things about the death of a child is that it tends to hit harder. It feels like studies that I've read and different things, it hits harder than any other type of grief. And so this arguably could have just stopped you permanently. And yet you did this thing with post-traumatic grief where you not only took that and worked through, and I'm sure are still working through, because grief comes in cycles. It doesn't go completely away. It's different things at different times, but you took that and all of a sudden you were doing this radically different kind of a thing where you were not only working through your own grief, but you were helping other people and their grief. Can you talk to me a minute about how did you go through that? How did you decide to make the shift? And what are the things that you've learned, the lessons, as you were saying, lessons of the universe, the lessons of the universe that has taught to you that has enabled you and empower you to do what you're doing now?
Okay, yes, I'll be happy to. Let me say this, Anna. When Allie died, my life went straight to hell. I literally spent the next 3 years in hell. And it felt not just like normal hell, it felt like Dante's description of hell, where you just cycle lower and lower and lower and lower. And just when you think it couldn't get any worse, it does. That's what that 3 year period felt like. And while I was in that abyss, I was really struggling. I was struggling with who am I? I was struggling with, will this ever get better? I was struggling with, why am I even alive? You know, why go on living after you've had a loss of that nature? And lots of deep kinds of depression sorts of questions that you probably wouldn't think about in a typical day. And before this happened, I was a very different person. I mean, I was all invested in my career, and I was all invested in success and attributes of success and so forth. And I can just tell you that when you've had your heart shattered so deeply, you question everything. You question your values. You question your history. You question your life. You look at everything through a fresh lens.
Mm.
Uh, in that period of time, I really tried to understand what was so broken in the American culture that this loss caught me so unprepared. I had
Mm.
never studied Greek before Allie's death. I never knew what Greek was. I mean, I'd had grandparents who died, and I had some relatives, other relatives who had died, but it didn't crush me. It didn't affect me as deeply as Allie's death did. Now, I want to be careful when I describe that because I don't want to use catastrophic terms in describing it, because here's the reality: we all die. If we grew up being taught that, instead of being taught like these platitudes, like a parent should never have to bury a child. And if
Mm.
you're the parent who's having to deal with the reality that your child died and you're actually making the funeral arrangements to bury your child, and someone says to you, a parent should never have to bury a child, that's not helpful. That's actually
Mm.
hurtful. And so, I was struggling in swimming in this culture of American responses to grief and loss. I was struggling just to get a footing anywhere. So I
Mm.
began looking at other cultures, and I began trying to understand, what do cultures that are a lot older than ours have to say about grief and loss? How do they process it? In some indigenous parts of the world, in some indigenous cultures that many Americans would call primitive, when someone
Mm.
has a major loss like that in their life, they separate themselves from their community and they go into isolation, and they spend a period of time struggling with, who am I now? Now that this has happened. And they come through it perhaps completely changed. I would say I came through it completely changed. I would say the person who is the author of these two books, the person who started this nonprofit, the person who gives away Loving Spirit, who hosts free um, workshops and has a free webinar starting very soon, and who gives away free workbooks to everybody who attends these sessions. That's not the same Dayle Spencer that you knew, Anna, 20 years ago. It's a different Dayle Spencer. And it's because my heart was shattered. It's because I was completely broken by grief that the new me is quite different than the old me. And an analogy of that, let me just draw on the Japanese culture for a moment. Japanese people are much better about accepting our brokenness, accepting our scars, accepting our woundedness, and not feeling a need to gloss over it because they see it more as life's journey. And they have this art form that's called kintsugi, where it started because in the 15th century, a shogun had a teacup that was broken and he wanted to have it mended. And his artisans in his court put it together with a kind of a lacquer or rosin and precious metal, gold or silver or platinum. And that teacup was actually more beautiful because it had been broken. And it was so beautiful that the Japanese people started this tradition of intentionally breaking their china, their porcelain cups and so forth, and putting them back together in a way that made them prettier, just like Hemingway said, at the broken places. And so my journey was also about reconstructing my life after Allie's death and trying to keep in my life the things that I thought were healthy and healing and beautiful and life affirming, and not mending it back together with negative things that didn't serve me to start with. It's kind of a long answer, but I hope it's responsive to what you were looking for.
Absolutely. It's totally responsive and beautifully put. Yeah, you are in so many ways expansive in your compassion in ways that seem um, not fundamentally different than the Dayle that I knew before, but certainly much more engaged with the process of empathy and understanding and putting something out there in the world that helps to heal it at a different level. This was part of you all along when you're doing international conflict resolution and you're helping teams to vision and all of these different things. It's part of you, but it did seem to take up to a new level when you went through this. And I've seen this in several different ways in you, and it's been beautiful to behold.
Oh.
But one of the ways that was profoundly beautiful and touching to me was what happened when you were at the bedside of my mother-in-law, Sue. And she was going through, in 2016, her dying process.
Yeah.
And you did some things there that were absolutely profoundly beautiful. And I would love it if you would share that experience with us, because many of the people on this call that are watching right now knew Sue, and I think it'd be meaningful to know how you walked with her in those last moments.
Oh, I'd be honored to do that. Um, Susan Camphouse was my sister-in-law, and I loved her. She was a great, great person in my life, and always giving to me, warm and accepting of me from the first moment we met. And it was my very great and humbling honor to be with her as she was making her transition from this life to the next life. And I had that honor. It was just the two of us alone in her hospital room as it happened, as she was dying. And I knew she was dying. She was actively dying. And I knew that this is the kind of experience that is rare and an incredible blessing. To me, it was very much analogous to being a midwife giving birth helping a mother in labor give birth to a new life, a new baby. Except it was that in reverse. I was helping my beloved sister-in-law leave this life and give birth to her new self in the next life. And so what I was trying to do was create for Susie what I would have wanted for myself had I been in her circumstances. I would have wanted someone who could hold a space for me that was safe, that was not frightening. I would have wanted a beautiful sense around me. I knew from my own work in this field that one of the last senses that we lose when we are dying is our sense of hearing. So I knew it was important that my voice be calm and that I provide for Susie an atmosphere where the things that she heard were not frightening like a hospital room typically is, but were soothing and would allow her to make her transition without fear. And so I had my cell phone with me, and I programmed Pandora to play a religious channel because she sang in the church choir at the First United Methodist Church in Bishop, California for many years, and that was the joy in her life. So I pulled up hymns, piano hymns actually, on that channel, and I held her hand as these hymns were playing, and I just said soothing things to her that what a joy. She'd spent her whole life in service to a God that she believed in so devoutly and in belief in Christ. And I said, Susie, now's the time for you to be rewarded for all of those wonderful labors of your life. And what a joy it is to be here with you as you go into that reward that you richly deserve. But I also had with me some eucalyptus oil, and so I just put it on her forehead and on her hands and on her feet because it has this beautiful fragrance. And I was trying to take away the smells of a hospital and create for her just in that little space soothing comfort. I also massaged her feet and her hands. She had IV tubes in her at the time, but I still was able to massage. You know, there is this little pressure point right here between your thumb and your index finger. And if you rub right there, it relieves stress. It can even relieve headaches. And so I was rubbing her in that little spot. And we had about 30 minutes in which I was able to say to her things like, it's okay. It's okay for you to let go. It's okay. This is going to be a wonderful triumphant homecoming for you. There is no fear here. There's only joy and love. And you will be embraced with joy and love as you make the transition. And so we had that, I would call it magical time together, that incredible closing together. And she softly stopped breathing and she quietly and calmly just relaxed into her own death, which in my mind was her own rebirth. So it was a very great honor for me. And I did do this. I knew this from Tibetan practices. Um, I asked the hospital staff after she died if they would just leave us alone for the next 30 minutes in peace and quiet. Don't come in the room, turn off the lights, and just let me sit with her as her body grew cold. And they did that. Now, Tibetans believe that in that initial 30 minutes after death is when the soul is separating from the physical body, and that it's really important to provide a safe, calm space for that person while that is happening, to allow the soul to exit peacefully. And so, for the next half an hour, I just sat with Susie in the dark and held her hand and could feel the warmth leaving her body. But it was just a joyous, joyous experience because she was done with that shell. You know, that part was over, and the part that was everlasting, that was eternal, was free of that body.
This makes me so happy to hear this story again. And I will say again what I have said before, which is I am totally happy that if I find myself in that space for you to midwife me, if you're still if somehow you're still around to do that, I just think that that's one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. And I wrote a poem. I'll try to include it in the comments later, but I did write a poem several years ago, describing the midwifery of life and death, and talking about how people are born, and you think this tunnel that you're going through is the end of everything, and then you're born into life, and then at the end of life again, this tunnel seems like it's forever, and but yet at the end is again life.
Yeah.
And so truly, all of these different things that we're going through are lessons that we learn, are places that we grow, and hopefully we are growing in love and care for ourselves and neighbor every day. That is, life is, I think of life as a school of learning how to love. And so if we could do that well, certainly life inherently feels like it has increasing levels of value. And so we're kind of working our way into that.
Yeah.
And we have opportunity. So we talk about the spiritual midwifery of birth and of our birth into the next life.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly, and I think it's in terms of grief in particular, there are all these extra moments of midwifery from what we were to what we're becoming.
Yeah.
And grief helps us to be able to identify and change the little sufferings that we go through. It feels like that they are those moments that help to transform us in different ways. And we, you and I and others that are working on helping with this process, are constantly trying to hone our skills of midwifery, I think. And
Yeah.
I wonder how many people are also doing this without even knowing that that's what they don't have a label. We're talking about labels. We don't have a label for that. But I think that we're not alone in being in groups of spiritual midwives. There are a lot of compassionate people. And one of the things that this time has highlighted is how many people really are exceptionally compassionate and trying to do things that make a difference. Yes, we see a lot on the news of people that are handling grief in cycles of kind of denial and anger. If we're using Kubler-Ross. And so we see that, and that gets a lot of press. But what may not get as much press, but is also present in fantastic ways, are things where people are trying to, in new and extraordinary ways, really midwife goodness and grace and wholeness in the world. And I wanted to highlight the way you're doing that right now. And that is through moving all of these workshops that you had in person all over the country to an online format. So I want to hear about that, and tell us what you're doing and when it's going live and how we can sign up and all of those kinds of things.
Thank you. I'd be happy to talk about that. Will and I just spent the last week filming. And we're Loving Spirit, which is the nonprofit that we started after Allie's death, is going virtual. We're going to be offering a webinar that will start streaming by June the 1st. And it will be it'll be comprised of 6 sessions. Anyone can register for it on our website, but it's not set up yet. It'll be set up in the next couple of weeks. lovingspirit.info is the name of the website. And when you register, you'll be able to download a free workbook that will accompany the 6 sessions of the webinar. In those 6 sessions, we talk about many tools, many mindsets, many skill sets that people can learn to help them navigate the journey of loss. And what we start from is a premise that because our culture has not succeeded in bringing children up with an acceptance of death as part of life. In fact, many families in this country try to shield their children from the reality of death rather than having them understand it. It's just part of our physiological beings. Our bodies don't last forever, And so we're trying to have us use better language when we talk about grief and loss. But when it happens to us, we're also trying to have people know things they can do immediately that can mitigate the degree of suffering that they have. The last thing I would want is for anybody else to spend 3 years of their life like I did. I would want people to know before the loss happens what to do. It's like the difference between fighting a fire and using techniques to mitigate fire before it happens. So fireproof clothing, alarm systems, smoke detectors, and so forth are so much more effective than waiting until a fire is brightly burning to do anything about it. So the webinar and all of the workshops have been about teaching people, even before they have grief and loss, but certainly once they have it, what are the things they can do? What are things they can learn? What are new behaviors they can adapt to help mitigate their pain and suffering? Let me give you an example. When we have a loss experience, talking story, telling our story is one of the areas where we often feel we're at the mercy of other people. We often feel like anytime anybody asks us about our loss, we're obliged to answer. Or any kind of question they want to ask us about our loss, we're obliged to answer, even if it's painful for us to talk about it. So we teach people how to tell their story in less painful ways. We teach them, for example, not to tell their story in catastrophic terms. What I mean by that is the words you use to talk about your loss can themselves be additional wounding experiences. The way you describe your loss can bring additional pain to your heart. And there are other words that you could use that might not be so painful. I mean, for example, with respect to Allie's death, I could say, my beloved daughter died in 36 hours from the flu. She was so successful. She was in love. She was just being accepted to graduate school. She was on the cusp of her whole life, and I could use lots and lots of descriptors like that. And every time I would say something like that, it's a little painful for me, even 9 years later. On the other hand, I could simply say, my daughter died at age 28 from the flu, which is also true and correct, but it doesn't have all of the emotion and pain packed up in that statement that there would be if I went into more detail about her death. So we empower people just in talking story about choosing words and choosing whether to even tell their story or not. We actually have them go through an exercise where they tell their story 3 different ways. In a live workshop, they're partnered with another participant and they have a timed period. They each have 10 minutes to tell their story of loss to the other. And then we give them only 2 minutes to tell their story of loss. And they realize that if you tell a longer story, you're probably unpacking a lot more painful details than if you tell an abbreviated story. Now, both stories are true and correct. You just have to decide which one is appropriate for you in the moment. Are you willing to go into the detail, or do you want a shorter version that's less painful for you to use? And having an elevator speech version of your story of loss can be a very important coping strategy in mitigating your grief. So that's just an example. There are myriad tools and mindsets and skill sets that they learn, and the webinar will be teaching. We just finished recording 6 hours of instructions. Think about that. That's the equivalent of 3 movies. and our producer has it right now, and he's editing it. It'll start streaming by June the 1st, and then we're translating it to Spanish, and it's also going to be closed captioned for the hearing impaired. So the pain of coronavirus forced us to adapt what we were doing. And this webinar now becomes the silver lining for Loving Spirit in that dark cloud of a pandemic that lets us continue to do the work that we've been doing for 6 years now through a different modality. So I hope your audience will tune in. I hope they will participate in the webinar, and we'd love to hear from people who've gone through it. What do they like about it? What would they have us change in the future?
Yeah, something that you just said, I have seen a number of times in my own inner circles, and that is when and how and in what spaces to share what pieces of yourself.
Yeah.
And not only will you hurt yourself in telling longer stories, but you also set yourself up for people who may not have worked through different elements of grief or understand pieces of your story to
Mhm.
then compound the grief
Yes. Yes.
by by saying things back, thinking that they're helping and actually not.
Yeah.
And so to be able to have self-control and good boundary setting for your own working through the process of grief, I think is incredibly important.
It's especially important, Anna, where the loss that they're grieving resulted from a suicide. Um, when,
Yes,
when we are consoling people who have a loss by suicide, our culture is, well, let me just call it nosy.
yes,
People feel like they have a right to know all of the details, and they don't.
right.
It's simply none of their business unless you, who bears that loss, want to share it. And,
Right.
and so we make it much harder on people who are recovering from a loss by suicide when we prod them with questions. Well, tell me what happened. Who found her? What was the last thing she ate? I mean, it's just incredible how people want to know and they think they're entitled to know, especially in this kind of loss. And the reality is, it's up to the person who bears the loss to decide if they're worthy to tell or not. And it's equally important to empower people to say, I appreciate your asking. I know you're coming from a place of caring about me, but right now I'm just not comfortable talking about it. And then change the subject, pivot to something else. It's your journey, it's your loss, and you're in charge of your story.
Right. And I think it has to be a both and, both learning how to turn conversations and protect yourself with appropriate boundaries
Yes.
and finding spaces that are safe in order to process the grief so that you don't have this grief that's just building on top of itself that you have not processed and you're not sharing with anybody. So it's a both and.
Yeah.
And so this is why places like what you're talking about, where we can safely and securely get online and really think about some things and maybe reach out and say, I don't know about this part or that part of what you're describing. Can you help me?
Yeah.
Having those safe spaces is vitally important because you can't just bury it and it goes away, and you
No.
can't not express it and work through it. So you have to do that,
Yeah.
but at the same time, how to do that without spewing it everywhere so that you're hurting yourself and others are hurting you, and you're not getting the real healing help that you need.
It, what I have learned the hard way, there are so many lessons I've learned the hard way from grief and loss, but one of them is you cannot outrun grief. You can't run fast enough or far enough to outrun grief. It will find you wherever you are. And so your point about not trying to bury it is critically important because compound grief is infinitely harder to deal with than simple grief. When Allie died, I had mere grief. I don't mean to diminish it in any way, but I was grieving one loss. It was very clear what was going on for me, and it just took me a long time to come to terms with it. Now, I'm not fixed, I'm not cured, but I have learned an awful lot of important coping mechanisms which allow me to accept my loss without all of the pain and baggage that I used to bring along with it for the first several years of this journey. So, yeah, I'm totally in agreement with you about what you're saying about both processing it, talking about it in a safe way, and limiting your exposure to people who would have you talk about it in ways that are not healthy for you.
Yeah, and in this particular moment in time, we've got all the regular grief plus now specific grief to people that are losing their lives from COVID,
Yes.
plus all the other levels. I mean, it is compound grief, and it's compounding every day, of loss of jobs, of loss of physical contact, of loss of being able to be in worship spaces together, having lunches together. There's like all these incredible compound grief moments, and we're all processing that differently. And that's why I think having understanding that we are all going through grief,
Yeah.
and then working on building our tool set to
Yep.
try to do that the best we can. Nobody has a magic sauce that says this is going to help you get over your grief. That doesn't work. It doesn't, that's not the human condition. That's not the way that things are. However, if we don't deal with it and we don't do things that actively engage with it and help us to process it and help us to have better language and skills in order to work through this time, I think it's a much more upsetting and dangerous situation that we're all in. Because it will come out no matter what you do, it will come out. So yes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
You have just named the reason why we are rushing to convert our workshops to an online format, because everybody's grieving and it's impossible to serve everybody unless you do something virtually so that people can access when they want, for how long they can access it, and it'll be there when they're ready to come back to tomorrow or next week, whenever they're ready to come back. We have really been full speed ahead on getting this webinar up and streaming, and we're about 2 weeks away from the launch date. So we're hoping to reduce some of that compound impact that you're describing.
For the role that you play in my life, and for the role that you are now playing in soon to be anyone with a computer's or internet access life, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Anna.
And thank you for thank you. And so we will put the links up to Loving Spirit, and we really do hope that people will take the opportunity in a couple of weeks when it goes live to be able to take some time to build their toolkit, so that as we go through this together, that they can do things which will help them to re-script their narrative towards a transformational process that will help us not just come through this, but come out of this, yes, with some scars, but also with some golden nuggets of wisdom and beauty, as you were talking about with the Japanese China, that will help us to have a better future than past and even present. And so thank you so much for joining us today, and God bless you. I love you.
Love you too. And to that we can all say amen.
Amen. Amen.